For 7 years, Claire Whitaker had done everything right. She had hired the best restoration specialists in the country. Men with walls full of certifications shops featured in magazines, hands that had rebuilt engines worth more than most people's homes. She had flown them to Dallas, written checks without flinching, and handed over the keys to a 1967 Mustang Shelby GT 500 that her father had loved more than almost anything in this world. $1.8 million later, the car still wouldn't start. It sat in the corner of Lone Star Classic Auto, like a beautiful breathing riddle, Highland green paint catching the light, chrome details polished to a mirror shine, and an engine that refused to wake up for anyone. Every expert had eventually said the same thing in different ways with different levels of embarrassment. I don't know why it won't run. Then, one afternoon, out of desperation, more than logic, Claire looked at the quiet man washing mud off the rear wheel well and heard herself ask, "You've been staring at it for months. You think you can fix it?" What she didn't know was why Mason Carter went pale the moment he looked under the hood. If you're new here, this channel is where we tell stories about ordinary people who do extraordinary things. Hit subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next. Claire Whitaker had learned early that the world respected composure. Her father had taught her that Robert Whitaker, a man who could walk into a room full of noise and make it quiet simply by the way he carried himself. He had built the family real estate firm from a single leased office in downtown Dallas into one of the most recognized names in Texas property development. He had done it without raising his voice, without burning bridges, and without ever letting anyone see him sweat. Claire had inherited the business, the composure, and the obsession. At 39, she ran Whitaker Properties with the same steady hand. Her father had managing contracts, and contractors, investors, and attorneys, all while keeping her expression exactly the way Robert had taught her, calm, readable, only when she chose to be. Her staff described her as fair. Her competitors described her as formidable. Neither group knew that she went home some nights and sat in her car in the parking garage for 20 minutes before she could make herself walk inside. The grief had never fully left. It had just learned to be quiet. Robert Whitaker had died 8 years before this story begins, long before Claire was ready to let him go. He had spent the final years of his life the way he had spent most of it, halfway under the hood of something grease on his forearms, a story half told to whoever was willing to listen. He had raced amateur circuits across the South in his younger years, not for money, but because he said he thought better when everything around him was moving fast. The racing community had loved him. The car community had respected him. And the one possession he had spoken about with more reverence than anything else, more than the business, more than the house, more than any trophy, was a 1967 Mustang Shelby GT 500 in Highland green that he had acquired in 1973 and never once sold. Claire remembered this first time he had let her sit in the driver's seat. She had been 9 years old, barely tall enough to see over the steering wheel. Robert had stood beside the open door, arms folded, watching her with an expression she hadn't been able to name then, but now understood was a particular kind of pride, the kind that comes from showing someone something you love. "She's not a wild horse if you pull the reins too hard," he had said. "You have to let her recognize you first." Claire had nodded the way children nod when they don't understand, but don't want to admit it. She had thought about those words on and off for 30 years. She thought about them more in the past 7, every time another expert walked away from the car with an apology and an invoice. The Mustang had not started once since Robert died. Not for the 3 specialists Claire had hired in the first year, working out of a shop in Fort Worth. Not for the team from California she had flown in at considerable expense, men who had rebuilt engines for museum collections and private collectors with budgets most people couldn't imagine. Not for the electrical expert or the vintage carburetor specialist, or the two-man crew who had spent 6 weeks with the car and dismantled nearly everything before quietly reassembling it and admitting defeat. $1.8 million across 7 years, and the engine had never once turned over. Lone Star Classic Auto was the latest stop. Brent Wallace had come recommended by 3 separate contacts in the vintage car world, all of whom had used words like legendary and meticulous and the best in the business. That reputation was not entirely invented. 20 years earlier, Brent had been exactly what people said. He was a technician with extraordinary instincts, the kind of mechanic who could diagnose a problem by sound alone, who had rebuilt 3 rare Shelby variants that other shops had declared unsalvageable. Motor Trend had featured his work. Collectors had waited months for an appointment, but success had arrived early and stayed long, and somewhere in the years between then and now, Brent had stopped doing the work himself. He supervised now. He consulted. He signed off on invoices and accepted credit for results that came from the hands of men he hired and underpaid. The passion had not disappeared entirely. It had simply been buried under the comfortable weight of reputation, and Brent had not noticed how long it had been since he had actually looked at a car with real attention. He had not looked at Claire's Mustang. Not truly. He had walked around it, pointed at things, directed his crew with the confidence of a man who believed his instincts were still sharp because no one had yet proven otherwise. He had been with the car for 4 months. It still had not started. The third member of this story arrived quietly, the way people who are used to being overlooked tend to do. Mason Carter was 36 years old and had been working at Lone Star Classic Auto for 11 weeks, hired as an hourly wash attendant, the person responsible for keeping the exterior vehicles clean, the shop floor clear, and himself invisible. He was good at the last part. The other mechanics barely registered him. Brent spoke to him only to redirect him away from whatever area he was currently occupying. What none of them knew was that Mason had not wandered into this job by accident. 11 weeks earlier, he had been sitting at the kitchen table of his apartment on the east side of Dallas, working through a stack of old car magazines he had pulled from a storage unit. His father's things, mostly boxes, he had not been ready to open for years. Tucked between 2 issues from 1987 was a regional enthusiast publication, thin as a pamphlet, with a small article about a 1967 Shelby GT500 currently under restoration at a Dallas shop. The article mentioned the car's owner, the car's history, and the car's previous custodian, a man named Robert Whitaker. Mason had read the name twice. Then he had set the magazine down and sat very still for a long time. He had applied for the job the following morning. I didn't know exactly what he was looking for. He knew only that his father, Henry Carter, had spoken Robert Whitaker's name exactly once before he died, in the context of something unfinished, something that had never been made right. Mason had grown up in the shadow of a story he'd never been told, completely raised by a man whose reputation had been destroyed by an accusation he had never been able to disprove. So Mason washed cars and said nothing, and watched the Mustang every chance he got. The air intake, the hood latch assembly, the floor panel on the driver's side. The places no one else looked. He was looking for something. He just didn't yet know if he'd recognize it when he found it. The call came on a Friday afternoon in late October. Claire was standing in the Lone Star parking lot when her phone rang. Her accountant, Dave Mercer, whose voice she had learned to read the way sailors read weather. When he spoke slowly, things were manageable. When he spoke quickly, they were not. He spoke quickly. The bank had reviewed Whitaker Properties' loan extension request and declined. The commercial real estate market had softened. 2 anchor tenants had vacated properties in the portfolio, and the numbers no longer supported the risk, at least not in the bank's estimation. The language in the letter was professional and bloodless. The bottom line was not Claire had 30 days to secure alternative financing or begin liquidating assets. She stood in the parking lot for a moment after the call ended, phone still in her hand, watching a truck pull out onto the street. Then she went inside. Brent was waiting near the Mustang with the particular expression he wore when he was about to deliver bad news in a way that made it sound like wisdom. He had heard things were difficult, the way people in small professional circles always hear things, and he had prepared accordingly. "Claire," he said, "I want to be straight with you. This car in its current condition is still worth significant money. The provenance alone, your father's name, the racing history, the documentation puts it at a strong position for auction. There are collectors who would pay well for it exactly as it sits." He paused to let that settle. "Sometimes," he said, "the right move is accepting what something is worth instead of chasing what we want it to be." Claire looked at the Mustang for a long moment. The Highland green paint caught the shop light the way it always did. The chrome trim, sharp and clean, the whole car giving the impression of something coiled and ready. It looked like it should be running. It had always looked like it should be running. Her father had stood next to this car and told her she had to let it recognize her first. He had said she would understand him better when she heard it run. She had spent 7 years and every available dollar trying to make that happen, and the car had given her nothing, and yet she could not make herself believe that selling it was anything other than a defeat she would carry for the rest of her life. "I hear you," she said. She did not say anything else. What happened next was not planned. Brent, perhaps emboldened by the silence, made a gesture toward the back of the shop where Mason was working, rinsing road grime off the lower body panels of a customer vehicle, head down, doing the job he was paid to do. Brent's tone shifted into the casual contempt that came naturally to men who had confused seniority with superiority. "Hell," he said loud enough for the room, "even the wash guy spends more time looking at it than my crew does. Maybe he's got the answer." A few of the mechanics laughed. It was the easy laughter of people who understood the joke required no thought. Mason did not look up. He kept working, his expression unchanged, the way a person moves when they have long since decided that other people's opinions of them are not information worth processing. Claire turned. She looked at Mason, really looked at him perhaps for the first time since he had started working there. She had noticed him in the peripheral way one notices furniture, registered his presence, without filing it, as significant. Now she watched him for a moment. The careful way he moved around the vehicle, the unhurried economy of his motions, the fact that even now with his back technically to the Mustang, his posture had angled itself slightly in the car's direction. She thought about the 7 years, the $1.8 million, the parade of credentialed, confident, ultimately useless experts. She thought about 30 days. She crossed the shop floor. Mason heard her coming and straightened, turning to face her with the neutral expression of someone who expects to be redirected to a different task. "You've been staring at that car since you started here," Claire said. There was no accusation in it, only observation. "Every time it comes through, you look at it like you know something. So I'm asking you directly, do you think you can fix it?" The shop had gone quiet in that particular way it does when people pretend not to be listening. Mason looked at her. Then he looked at the Mustang. His gaze moved to the hood latch, then the driver's side rocker panel, then back to Claire. He did not smile. He did not hedge. "Give me 72 hours, he said. "No crew, no extra budget, just the car and enough quiet to work. If I'm wrong, you sell it." Nobody laughed this time. Brent's reaction was immediate and architectural, the kind of objection built in layers, each one designed to sound reasonable while concealing the one beneath it. The first layer was professional concern. A car of this value, This rarity, this historical significance could not responsibly be handed to someone without verified credentials. There were liability questions, insurance considerations, industry standards that existed for good reason. The second layer was practical skepticism. What exactly qualified a wash attendant to attempt what multiple certified specialists had failed to accomplish? What tools did he have? What training? What was his diagnostic approach? The third layer, the one Brent did not articulate, but that sat visible beneath everything else, was simpler and more honest than either of the first two. If Mason Carter succeeded here in this shop on this car, the math was brutal. 20 years of reputation, 3 magazine features, a client list that read like a collector's directory, all of it would be measured against the fact that an hourly wash attendant had solved in 72 hours what Brent Wallace had not solved in 4 months. That was the layer that made his voice go tight. "Claire," he said, pulling her a few steps away from the group, "I understand you're under pressure right now, but this is not the moment to make an emotional decision about a vehicle worth this kind of money. Let me bring in one more specialist, someone I've worked with in Arizona, very strong background in Shelby Electrics. 2 more weeks. We've had 4 months, Claire said. Brent stopped. 4 months. She said again, not unkindly, but without any softness in it either. And before that 7 years, and before that every specialist I could find. I'm not making an emotional decision. I'm making a different one. She turned back toward Mason. 72 hours, Claire said. What do you need? Mason considered the question with the unhurried attention of someone who had already been thinking about it for 11 weeks. The shop to myself after closing, he said. Access to the car, the original documentation if you have it, and the parts records Brent's team compiled. And I need the car left alone during the day. No one touches it between now and when I start. Claire nodded. Done. She held out the key, a simple brass key on a plain ring that had lived in her jacket pocket every day for 7 years, like a worry stone. Mason took it with both hands. He held it for a moment, as if calibrating the weight of it. Then, instead of moving toward the driver's door, he crouched beside the car, eye level with the lower frame rail along the driver's side, and looked. Not a quick glance, a real look, long and still. His eyes moved along the seam where the floor pan met the rocker panel, along the edge where original factory welds met whatever had been done to this car in the decades since. When he spoke, his voice was low enough that only Claire caught it. He didn't want anyone starting it the normal way. Claire felt the words land somewhere specific, not in her chest, where grief usually lived, but somewhere older. What do you mean? She asked. Mason stood. He looked at the hood, then back at her. I mean, the car isn't broken, he said. Not the way everyone's been treating it. I need 72 hours to be sure, but I don't think this is a mechanical failure. I think it's a lock. The shop was very quiet. Brent's expression had shifted from indignant to something harder to name, a look that lived in the narrow space between dismissal and unease. He opened his mouth, then closed it. Claire studied Mason's face. He was not performing certainty for the room. He was not selling anything. He was looking at the car with the expression of someone in the early stages of recognizing something they had suspected for a long time. If you damage it, she said, this conversation ends very badly for both of us. I know, Mason said. And if you're wrong, then you sell it, he said, and I go back to washing cars, and we both move on. He said it without self-pity and without bravado, which Claire found more convincing than either. She left Mason alone with the key. Mason started at 10:15 on a Monday night, 40 minutes after the last mechanic locked up and left. He did not begin with the engine. That was the first thing Claire noticed when she pulled up the security camera feed from her laptop. At home, she had expected him to go straight to the hood, to do what every specialist before him had done, which was treat the problem as something buried under metal and grease and solvable by extraction. Instead, Mason stood beside the car for almost 4 minutes without touching it, just looking. His arms were at his sides, his head moving slowly from the front quarter panel to the roofline to the rear. The way a person reads a page they have read before and are now reading differently. Then he got on his knees and started on the floor. He peeled back the driver's side carpet with careful hands, not yanking, not cutting, just working the edges loose with a flathead, and his fingers rolling it back in sections and laying each piece aside in order. A man who kept pieces in order was a man who intended to put them back. Underneath the margins of the floor pan pressed along the inner rocker seam was wiring. Old wiring, cloth and rubber loom that hadn't been standard since the early 70s, intact in most places, but interrupted in 2 spots by splices covered in electrical tape that had gone brittle with age. Mason photographed everything before he touched it. He worked with a small LED inspection light clipped to his collar, a set of probes connected to an analog multimeter. He had brought in a canvas bag and a notebook he wrote in periodically. He did not use the shop's diagnostic computer. He did not reference any of the service records Brent's team had compiled, not yet. He was reading the car the way his father had taught him to read cars from the inside out, listening before cutting, tracing before testing. Claire watched until past midnight, then closed the laptop and lay in the dark, thinking about things she couldn't name. In the shop, Brent was not sleeping well either. What bothered him was not the specific fear of being wrong. He had been wrong before, and the industry was large enough to absorb individual failures. What bothered him was the particular kind of wrong this might be. If Mason found something, that Brent should have found something visible. Something that didn't require supernatural instinct, but simply required the kind of slow, patient attention Brent had stopped giving to cars years ago. That was a different accounting entirely. One he was not prepared for. So he waited, and he prepared his arguments, and he told himself that 72 hours would prove nothing. By the second night, Mason had worked his way through the electrical system from the firewall to the rear of the cabin. What he found was this: the car had been modified. Not recently, the work was old, the materials dating to the same era as the car itself, made by someone who knew exactly what they were doing and wanted the changes to be invisible unless you knew to look. A secondary relay had been added to the ignition circuit, wired through a concealed switch mounted behind the lower dash panel on the passenger side. The switch was small and flat, positioned behind a false bracket that looked original to the car. If you didn't know it was there, you would never find it. Several of Brent's team had apparently found it, noted it in a service record, tested it, found it functional, and moved on without understanding what it was actually doing. But it wasn't the switch that stopped the car. The switch was part of a sequence, and the sequence had more steps. Mason spent the better part of the second night tracing the relay through the chassis wiring, following a branch circuit that didn't appear in any factory diagram until he found where it terminated in the dash, in the steering column, in a place that made him sit back on his heels and look at the ceiling for a long moment. Then he went to the front of the car and lifted the hood. He started at the firewall and worked forward, running his hand along surfaces, feeling for irregularities. He found it near the front left of the engine bay, a mark small and deliberately faint, scratched into the metal with something narrow, a 5-pointed star, no larger than a thumbnail, pressed into the inner fender, just above where the fender brace met the firewall. Mason went very still. He had seen that mark once before in his life. He had been 16 years old, sitting in his father's kitchen, watching Henry Carter look through a shoebox of old photographs. One of those photographs showed a car, a different Shelby from the same era, with that same mark scratched into the same location. Henry had touched the photograph and said nothing, and when Mason had asked what it meant, his father had looked at him with an expression that was not quite grief and not quite pride and said only, "That means I built it." Henry Carter had died without explaining further. Mason stood in the quiet shop with his hand near the mark and felt 11 weeks of careful waiting collapse into something immediate and necessary. He looked at the Mustang, the whole car, the sum of all its modifications and secrets and locked away intentions, and understood that he had not come here by accident. Neither had the car. He found the envelope on the third night. He had been working through the trunk, methodically removing the spare tire housing and the felt lining in sections, checking the structural seams, running his fingers along the inner quarter panels where the metal folded back on itself. The envelope was taped to the underside of the trunk floor, pressed flat against the spare tire, well wrapped in an oil-resistant sleeve of the kind used in the 70s to protect documents stored near mechanical components. The tape had dried to the texture of old leaves. The sleeve was intact. Mason sat on the shop floor with it in his hands for a moment before he opened it. Inside was a photograph, black and white, printed on the thick paper stock of an earlier era, slightly curved from decades of being stored flat under pressure. Two men standing beside a Highland green Mustang, the car unmistakably parked on a dirt lot, with what looked like a drag strip in the background. Both men were young, squinting slightly against afternoon sun. Mason knew his father's face from photographs. Henry Carter at 28 looked exactly the way Mason had always imagined him: lean, with the careful posture of a man who worked with his hands and was proud of it, wearing a mechanic's shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbow. His hand rested on the fender with the ease of ownership. The other man, taller, broader in the shoulders, with a particular quality of stillness in his expression, Mason recognized from the framed photographs in Robert Whitaker's obituary, which Claire had published in the Dallas Morning News 8 years ago. Robert Whitaker, Henry Carter, the same car, standing together like men who trusted each other. Mason turned the photograph over. On the back, in handwriting he didn't recognize, "For the last race, only the right hands will wake her." He read it twice, then he sat with it. The full shape of what he had found assembled itself slowly. The car was not broken. It had never been broken. It had been locked deliberately, carefully, by a man who knew exactly how to make a lock that looked like a malfunction. The secondary relay, the hidden switch, the routing through the steering column, these were a sequence, a protocol. Something you could only complete if you knew the steps in order with the right inputs at the right intervals. And at the end of the sequence, the final step, the one that would close the circuit and allow the ignition to fire, was something Mason had identified on the second night, but had not yet fully understood. A contact point built into the base of the steering wheel beneath the factory Mustang emblem. Henry Carter had machined it himself. The tolerances were hand-fitted, the materials period correct, the concealment flawless. It was not a button. It was not a switch. It was a pressure plate, a small, precisely calibrated plate that responded to the weight of a flat palm placed against the emblem, with a specific, unhurried intention, not a command, a recognition. Mason thought about what Robert Whitaker had told his daughter, the phrase Claire had mentioned in passing, when explaining why the car mattered to her: "You have to let her recognize you first." Henry Carter had built that sentence into the car's ignition system. Mason put the photograph in his notebook. He was still sitting on the floor when he heard the side door open. Brent Wallace walked in at 11:47. He stopped when he saw Mason beside the open trunk, and something moved across his face. Surprise, then calculation, then a version of casual authority assembled too quickly to be convincing. "Working late," Brent said. "Yes," Mason said. Brent's eyes went to the notebook, then to the trunk, then to the oil-resistant sleeve on the floor. He crossed the shop at a measured pace and looked down at the open trunk. "Find something," he said. "Some old documentation," Mason said. "I'll need to see anything you find," Brent said. "Chain of documentation for the restoration file." "I'll make sure Claire sees everything," Mason said. The emphasis was slight. It was enough. Brent stood. He looked at Mason with the expression of a man deciding how much of a problem someone is going to be. "You know," Brent said, his voice carrying the particular gentleness of a threat delivered in a reasonable tone. "I've been doing this a long time. I know how these situations read when they go sideways. A guy with no credentials, no license, no professional standing, finds something in a client's vehicle that nobody else found. Could look a lot of different ways." Mason said nothing. "I'm not saying that's what's happening," Brent said. "I'm saying it's worth thinking about how this lands. For you." Mason looked at him for a moment. Then he closed the trunk, carefully picked up his notebook, and stood. "I'll be done by tomorrow night," he said. "Claire can decide what it means." Brent held his gaze for another moment, then turned and left the way he had come. Mason called Claire at 7 the following morning. He told her he had found something in the car. He told her it was significant. He told her she needed to come to the shop before anyone else arrived, and when she asked why, he said, "Because what I'm about to show you is going to be easier to hear without an audience." She was there by 7:30. Mason laid it out on the workbench in the order he had found it, the photographs of the hidden switch, the circuit diagrams he had sketched by hand, the photographs of Henry Carter's mark under the hood, and finally the envelope, the oil-resistant sleeve, and the photograph of two young men standing beside a Highland green Mustang on a dirt lot in what looked like 1973 or 1974. Claire did not speak for a long time. She picked up the photograph and held it with both hands, the way people hold things they are afraid of dropping. She looked at her father's face, young, unhurried, standing next to a car he had not yet made famous, and then at the man beside him whose name she had never heard Robert mention, not once in her entire life. "Henry Carter," she said. "My father," Mason said. She looked up at him. He held her gaze steadily, giving her time to place what she was seeing. Mason's face beside the face in the photograph, the structural similarities that made the relationship legible without explanation. "Why didn't you tell me this when you started working here?" she said. "Because I didn't know what I had," Mason said. "I knew my father had mentioned your father's name. I knew something had happened between them that my father never recovered from professionally. I came here to look at the car. I didn't know what I'd find." Claire set the photograph down carefully. "Tell me about the car," she said. Mason walked her through it, the sequence, the relay, the hidden switch, the pressure contact beneath the Mustang emblem. He explained the mechanism in plain language, and when he described the final step, the flat palm, the deliberate stillness, the act of introduction rather than ignition, he recited what she had told him Robert used to say, and watched her expression change. "You have to let her recognize you first." "He built that sentence into the car," Claire said. "Your father designed the philosophy," Mason said. "My father built the mechanism. They did it together." Claire was quiet for a moment. "Why?" she said. "Why go to that trouble?" Mason told her what he understood and what he suspected. The 1974 race illegal, organized by a private promoter, run on a closed stretch of road outside of Abilene. Robert and Henry had entered together, Robert driving, Henry having built out the engine. They had won. And after they won, something had gone wrong, not with the car, but with the people surrounding it. The promoter had accused Henry of tampering with a competitor's vehicle, causing a mechanical failure that resulted in an accident. The accusation had no documentation behind it, but it had weight because the promoter had connections, and Henry Carter had only his reputation, which was all the accusation needed to destroy. Henry had been effectively blacklisted. The vintage car community in the South was not large, and the story had traveled quickly, selectively, and without the facts that might have complicated it. Robert Whitaker had spent years trying to help Henry quietly. But the evidence that might have cleared him, evidence implicating the promoter rather than Henry, was something Robert had held on to, kept safe in the one place he trusted completely. The car. There were documents in the envelope, Claire asked. A photograph and a handwritten note, Mason said. But the photograph is evidence in itself. The timing, the location, the people visible in the background. A dated photograph from that event was enough to place the promoter's crew near the competitor's vehicle before the race. Your father knew that. He kept it. Claire looked at the photograph again. He was waiting for the right person to find it, she said. Or the right time, Mason said. Maybe both. The side door opened. Brent came in with two men Claire didn't immediately recognize, one carrying a leather portfolio, one in a suit that didn't belong in a garage. Brent's expression was composed in the specific way of someone who has rehearsed what they are about to say. Claire, he said, I'm glad you're here. This is David Harrow from Meridian Auction House and Tom Greer from First Capital Lending. Given the timeline on your loan situation, I took the initiative of arranging a preliminary valuation. If we move quickly, Meridian can place the car in their December auction that gives the bank a concrete liquidation timeline and buys you some breathing room. Claire looked at Brent, then at the two men he had brought, then at the workbench, the photographs, the circuit diagrams, the envelope, the image of her father standing beside Henry Carter, with their hands resting on the car they had built together and then locked against the world. You called them last night, she said to Brent, after you came into the shop. Brent's composure held, but only just. I was trying to help you. Mason, Claire said without looking away from Brent. How much time do you need to finish? Mason was already moving toward the driver's door. 10 minutes, he said. Brent moved to step between Mason and the car. Claire, he said, his voice dropping into its most reasonable register. You have 30 days before the bank begins recovery proceedings against the company your father built. David Harrow is one of the most respected automotive auctioneers in the country. If the car goes to December auction, we are looking at a number that solves your problem completely and cleanly. David Harrow opened the leather portfolio and produced a single sheet, a preliminary estimate with a figure at the bottom that Claire could read from where she was standing. It was a significant number. It was not a number that required a working engine. The car's provenance is the value, Harrow said, in the pleasant voice of a man who had delivered unwelcome news in comfortable packaging many times before. Robert Whitaker's ownership history, the documentation, the originality of the bodywork collectors in our December catalog will compete for this regardless of mechanical condition. We could have a contract drawn by end of week. I found the locking mechanism, Mason said, addressing Claire directly. I know the full sequence. I can start the car today. Brent turned to look at him. Then do it. Right now. Start it. It was not an invitation. It was a dare calculated to produce a public failure, and everyone in the room understood that. Mason looked at Claire. She held his gaze for a moment. Then she said, "Go ahead." Mason walked to the driver's door and lowered himself into the seat. He adjusted his position, settled his hands at the base of the wheel, and was still for a moment. Then he began. He reached behind the lower dash panel on the passenger side and toggled the hidden switch, once holding it for a 3 count, then releasing. He pulled the headlight stalk outward twice in succession. The second pull held slightly longer than the first. He depressed the clutch to the floor and held it, then brought it up to the friction point and held it there. He turned the ignition key to the first position, not to start, just to on, and waited 4 seconds exactly. The shop was completely silent. Brent's arms were folded. Harrow and Greer stood near the door. Claire stood at the workbench with her hands flat on the surface, her father's photograph within reach. Mason turned the key to the start position. Nothing happened. The engine did not catch. There was no turnover, no cough, no preliminary sound of any kind. The car sat exactly as it had sat for 7 years, silent, indifferent, withholding. Brent unfolded his arms slowly. Mason sat in the driver's seat without moving. He had done it correctly: the switch, the stalk, the clutch, the timing. Every step was right. Every step except the last. The last step was the one his father had never written down. The pressure plate beneath the emblem, he knew. It was there, he knew its function, he understood its design. But understanding a mechanism and knowing how to complete it were not the same thing. His father had built this final step not as a technical problem, but as a relational one. It required something Mason had been turning over in his mind for 2 nights without being able to name. He stared at the Mustang emblem on the steering wheel. Behind him, Brent's voice arrived with the quiet satisfaction of a man who had been waiting for exactly this moment. "Claire," he said, "let's talk about December." Claire looked at him, at the back of his head, at his hands still resting on the wheel, and felt the 30 days and the $1.8 million and every failed expert settle around her like weather. Harrow was already uncapping his pen. Claire's hand closed around the photograph. Not deliberately, it was the hand finding the nearest solid thing, the instinct of a person trying to keep their footing. But when her fingers touched the paper, she looked down at it. Her father at 28, standing beside a car he had spent the rest of his life protecting. His hand resting on the fender with the ease of a man who understood what he had built and why it mattered. She heard his voice the way she always heard it when she was tired enough to stop managing the grief. "You have to let her recognize you first." She had heard that sentence as a child and filed it as poetry. She had heard it as an adult and filed it as loss. She was hearing it now, for the first time, as what it actually was. "Mason," she said. He turned from the wheel to look at her. His expression was open in the way that faces go when a person has stopped protecting themselves and is simply present. "You're not supposed to start it," she said. "You're supposed to introduce yourself." The shop was silent enough that the fluorescent light above the parts cabinet was audible. Mason looked at the emblem on the steering wheel, the running horse silver against black, the factory Mustang logo his father had chosen specifically, had machined the contact plate beneath specifically, because Robert Whittaker had once described his car not as a machine, but as an animal that needed to be met on its own terms. Mason placed his palm flat against the emblem. Not pressing, not commanding. The weight of an open hand, steady and without urgency, the way you might rest your hand on the shoulder of someone you were meeting for the first time and wanted to trust. He held it there. Then he ran the sequence again. The switch, the stalk, the clutch, the key to the first position. 4 seconds. He turned the key to start. The Shelby GT500 erupted. It did not turn over gently. It did not cough and settle. It came alive the way things do when they have been waiting a long time, fully, immediately, with a sound that was less mechanical than physical. A deep concussive roar that moved through the floor of the shop and up through the walls and into the chest of every person standing in the room. 7 years of silence ended in a single second, and the sound that replaced it was not subtle about what it was. Brent took a step backward. Harrow's pen stopped moving. Claire's hand came up to her mouth. The engine ran. It ran cleanly, steadily, with the particular authority of a well-built V8 that has been carefully preserved and is now doing exactly what it was designed to do. Mason sat in the driver's seat, with both hands on the wheel, and his eyes closed for a moment. And in the expression on his face when he opened them was something Claire recognized, not triumph, but relief. The specific relief of a person who has been carrying something heavy for a very long time and has just been allowed to set it down. She was crying before she knew she had started. Not for the car's monetary value, not for the 30 days or the loan or the auction estimate in Harrow's portfolio. She was crying because the engine sounded exactly like something her father had tried to give her and had not been able to give her until now from the other side of 8 years of absence. She was crying because a man she had never met had built this for her, had built the care and the trust and the patience into the machine itself. Self and his son had been the only person in 7 years who had understood it well enough to find the way in. Brent left without speaking. Harrow closed the portfolio. Greer followed them both out without a word. The way people exit a room when they understand the situation has resolved itself without them. Mason turned the engine off after 3 minutes. He sat in the quiet for a moment, then got out and stood beside the car, the way his father stood beside it. In the photograph, one hand resting on the fender, relaxed, present. Claire wiped her face and looked at him. "Tell me the rest," she said. "All of it." So Mason told her. He told her about Henry Carter and Robert Whittaker and the 1974 race outside Abilene. He told her about the promoter, the accusation, the blacklisting, the way a lie travels faster than a correction in a small community. He told her his father had spent the years after that race in the diminishing margins of a profession. He had been effectively ejected from taking jobs where he could find them, rebuilding engines in other people's garages for cash, never recovering the standing he had earned, and then lost to someone else's story. He told her his father had died believing that the truth was somewhere in that car, and that Robert Whittaker had kept it safe, and that someday the right person would find it. He told her he had grown up watching Henry Carter quietly diminish under the weight of an uncleared name, had learned mechanics from him because it was the one language they shared completely, and had walked away from that world after Henry died because he couldn't figure out how to be in it without his father. Claire listened to all of it without interruption. When Mason finished, she picked up the photograph from the workbench and looked at it one more time. 2 young men, a dirt lot, a Highland green car, afternoon sun, a sentence on the back about the right hands. "My father kept this for 40 years, she said. He kept it because he was waiting for someone to come find it. He kept it, Mason said, because he trusted that someone would." The weeks that followed were not simple, but they were clear. Claire spent 3 days going through Brent Wallace's billing records with her accountant and a contract attorney. What they found was not the work of a criminal. It was something more ordinary and in some ways more disheartening. Parts replaced that didn't need replacing. Diagnostic hours billed for sessions the shop's own internal logs didn't support. A labor rate applied to work performed by junior mechanics at a fraction of the cost. None of it dramatic. All of it deliberate. The accumulated invoices of a man who had once been genuinely skilled and had quietly traded that skill for the easier business of maintaining a reputation on other people's work. Claire terminated the contract with Lone Star Classic Auto and recovered what she could through the attorney. The photograph from the trunk, combined with 3 additional documents Claire located in her father's personal files once she knew what to look for, was enough. Her attorney contacted a historian who specialized in vintage motorsport and a private investigator with experience in insurance fraud cases from the relevant era. The promoter from the 1974 race had died in 2009, but the documentation was sufficient to establish formally and on record that the accusation against Henry Carter had no evidentiary basis and significant circumstantial evidence pointing in the opposite direction. It was not a courtroom verdict. It was not a front-page correction. But it was a document that existed, signed and dated, that said Henry Carter had not done what he had been said to have done. And for Mason, who had grown up inside the silence that accusation had created, it was enough. He read the document twice at his kitchen table, the same table where he had found the magazine article 11 weeks earlier, and then he folded it carefully and put it in the shoebox with his father's photographs. Claire solved the financing problem without selling the car. The story had moved quietly through the vintage automotive community. By then, a 1967 Shelby GT500 with a hand-built locking mechanism, a hidden photograph, and a 50-year-old secret. 3 separate collectors contacted Claire within 2 weeks, each offering figures that would have resolved her financial situation several times over. She declined all 3. Instead, she worked with her accountant to restructure the company's debt against 2 commercial properties that had appreciated significantly, a solution that had been available for some time, but required accepting that the business needed restructuring rather than rescue. The Mustang was not a solution. It was not collateral. It was a car, and it was hers, and it was going to stay that way. The Whitaker-Carter Legacy Fund was Claire's idea, arrived at over several conversations with Mason in the weeks following the restoration. The premise was straightforward: a private endowment dedicated to the preservation of historically significant American vehicles, with specific attention to cars, whose stories involved working mechanics and craftsmen, whose contributions had been minimized, misattributed, or erased by time and circumstance. Not a museum, not an auction house. Something more like an archive with a garage attached, a place where the work of people like Henry Carter could be documented, preserved, and properly credited. Mason's first response, when Claire described it, was a long silence. His second response was, "That's a significant undertaking." "Yes," Claire said. "You'd need someone who understands both the mechanical side and the historical documentation process." "I know," Claire said. "I've been thinking about who that person might be." Another silence, shorter this time. "I haven't worked professionally in 8 years, Mason said. "I know that too," Claire said. "I'm asking anyway." The test drive happened on a Tuesday evening in early December at a privately owned stretch of road outside of Weatherford, Texas, an old quarter-mile that had been used for informal racing since the 1960s and was now owned by a collector who had known Robert Whitaker and who agreed when Claire called to open the gate without asking too many questions. The sky was doing what Texas skies do in December, turning colors that don't have standard names, the light going flat and amber, and then suddenly, briefly, something close to gold before the dark came in. Mason drove. Claire sat in the passenger seat with her window down and her arm resting on the door. The Mustang moved the way it was supposed to move, with authority and intention, the engine doing exactly what Henry Carter had built it to do 50 years ago on a dirt lot outside of Abilene with a friend who trusted him. The sound filled the car and spilled out across the empty road and disappeared into the Texas dark. They didn't speak much. There wasn't a great deal that needed saying. Claire listened to the engine and heard her father in it, not a ghost, not a grief, but something more useful. A voice that had been trying to reach her for a long time, through 7 years, and $1.8 million, and every wrong pair of hands until finally the right ones arrived. Mason listened to the engine, and heard his father too, not the diminished, quietly broken man of his childhood memories, but the earlier version, the one who had been skilled enough to build something this precise and this patient and this lasting. The man Henry Carter had actually been before someone else's lie had decided what his story would be. The Mustang ran clean all the way to the end of the road and back. When Mason brought it to a stop and cut the engine, the silence that followed was a different kind of silence than the one that had lived in the car for 7 years. That silence had been a question. This one was an answer. Claire looked at the dark road ahead for a moment, then at Mason. "Same time next week," she said. Mason looked at her. Something in his expression shifted, not quite a smile, but the thing that precedes one in a person who has not had much recent practice. "Yeah," he said. "Same time next week." There's something this story keeps coming back to, and it's not the car. It's the idea that the most important things, the ones worth protecting, worth waiting for, worth building a lock around, don't respond to force or credentials or the right amount of money. They respond to the right kind of attention. To someone who shows up not to take something, but to understand it. Mason Carter spent 11 weeks being invisible in that shop. He wasn't waiting for permission. He was waiting for the moment the car would let him in, and when it did, he was ready, because he had never stopped paying attention. Henry Carter built a mechanism that could only be opened by someone who understood why it existed. Robert Whittaker kept a photograph for 40 years because he believed the right person would eventually come looking. And Claire Whittaker, in the worst 30 days of her professional life, made the one decision nobody around her thought was reasonable, and it turned out to be the only one that mattered. Sometimes the person who can actually help you is already in the room. They're just not the one with the title. If that kind of story resonates with you, the ones about people who were overlooked, underestimated, and turned out to be exactly what was needed, subscribe to this channel. We find these stories, and we tell them the way they deserve to be told. Hit the button, and we'll see you in the next one.